Recently, Anjum Chaudhry was facing arrest again in the UK. This is not the first time he's been embroiled in terrorist activities on English soil, British soil, and he still managed to set up quite a network. There are hundreds of such cases in the UK, in addition to Khalistani terrorism being bred on United Kingdom soil. So I know you live there, so I really wanted to discuss what is this leeway that the UK government gives to breeding terrorism against a democratic, friendly nation. If you could throw some light on that.
Thanks, Shagarika. So essentially, Anjum Chaudhary has been probably one of the most hated, uh, you know, British uh, Muslims, if there was anyone like that. He was essentially the head of this institution or this organization called Al Muhajirun, which was essentially banned in the United Kingdom sometime in the early 2000s. And he has always been involved in extremely feral activities against the British ecosystem. He essentially uses freedom of speech to go against, drive motions against freedom of speech. So he would
Oh.
use his right to freedom of speech to say, that Sharia should be essentially implemented across the United Kingdom, where democracy and freedom and free will needs to be curbed, and that is the kind of duplicit and hypocritical man that we have. So, like you pointed out, he was arrested a day or so ago. There was another man arrested this morning while he was, rather yesterday morning, when he was essentially coming into London Heathrow from Canada. And it is believed that both the arrests of Anjum Chaudhary yesterday morning at about 5:30 a.m. in the morning, and this other individual who got arrested at Heathrow are both connected. And there are several other houses that have been raided as well across East and West London all of yesterday. So there is definitely something which is brewing, and I think all of us will be keenly watching out when the authorities do actually publish uh, the details into why these arrests have been made and what are the what are the ground realities and the sort of hypothesis to their arrests.
Right. Adit, thank you so much for joining me today. I'd love for you to introduce yourself to our viewers because you're very popular on the Twitter Spaces space, but my viewers may not be familiar with what you do in London and your work there.
Thanks. So essentially, on my day-to-day job, I'm a cybersecurity expert and I work within financial institutions. But that's the mundane side of things. The exciting side of things is that I'm part of this small think tank called Index Society, and where there's a group of individuals who I'm associated with, and we try and dismantle any sort of anti-India narrative and anti-Hindu narrative that specifically stems from the academic circles. So we would pick either media articles or academic works presented by academicians and journalists, and we would essentially dismantle any sort of anti-Indian narrative and anti-Hindu narrative that they peddle. Typically, we would pick people like Natasha Cole or Angana P. Chatterjee or um Kalpana P. Wilson. So those are the kind of people that we would essentially pick, and we would try and pick holes within their secondary research and go into the primary research of trying to dismantle their work.
I think that's a brilliant endeavor and much, much needed because a superficial discussion, say on Twitter or in conversation amongst ourselves, is not going to bring out their bigotry. And the fact that it affects academic spaces at such scale is very, very scary. So thank you for doing what you do. Now, back to the subject. With regards to Anjum Chaudhary and his associates who were recently arrested, this is not the first time he's being arrested, right? This is the second time he's being arrested. He's been implicated multiple times before this in actual terrorist activities. It's not something minor or just about causing a ruckus. He's been implicated in terrorist activities. So how has the British government allowed this to pass unnoticed for so long?
I think I think it's the pride of the British government, and that pride is essentially, allowing freedom of speech to everybody, no matter how feral or how vile. So essentially, the British government has they've essentially looked at people like Anjum Chaudhary with a sense of political correctness, where they believe that freedom of speech is absolutely paramount, and no matter how much they even if it goes against the ethos of the British culture, the British society, or the British polity, or the British government on its own, they would still allow adequate and appropriate amount of space to its fiercest critics, and Anjum Chaudhary just happens to be one of them. And that unfortunately has not paid off very well for the British government, because people like Anjum Chaudhary have ended up just not being terrorist sympathizers, but they've actually ended up being facilitators of various terrorist activities which have happened not only just in Britain, but across the globe, in Chechnya, in Pakistan, in India, in Bangladesh. There have been people who have heard his speeches and have got motivated by what he's the kind of false narratives that he peddles, and have essentially been espoused by that, taking up arms and fighting the so-called jihad war. So it's quite unfortunate, but that is the reality. I was grateful to the British government for having curbed his freedom of speech between 2019 and 2022, where there were a lot of restrictions which were placed on him. His assets were essentially frozen. He did not have access to either PCs or mobile phone or smart devices. But that was essentially lifted earlier last year.
Under the
But
conservative government.
sorry, say that again.
Under the conservative government?
Under the conservative government, that is correct. But that was the sentencing
Oh,
that he was handed out by the Old
right,
Bailey. So I don't think the conservative government
right, right.
should
Got
have
it.
done much to restrict, even under the Terrorism Act of 2000. I don't think they could have done much
Right,
to
right, got it.
curb his, uh, you know, uh, the upliftment of his ban. Um, and yes, hopefully, this time he goes in for a long time, and he is thrown into this dark pit where there is absolutely no coming back. And I've got my fingers crossed for that. So hopefully, the British people and the wider society in general can breathe a little bit of respite, because people like Anjum Chaudhary are problematic, and the British government needs to come out and call out this sort of rabid behavior, this rabid agenda that is peddled by people like Anjum Chaudhary, and other people like Avtar Singh Khanda, who's recently just died. Uh, uh, the British government has been using human rights as a garb, as a front, to essentially allow a lot of these kind of elements within the British society to essentially carry on with their day-to-day agenda, which is not only against British government in general, but it actually goes against free and open society all in all.
So I do have this thought here, and correct me if I'm wrong, but why are Western human rights discourses so dictated by rights for the perpetrators and not for the victims? Sure, we can argue that they have a judicial system to fall back on. However, the judicial system is often ineffective, and we do see a lot of victims, like in the grooming gang scandals led primarily by Pakistani Muslim gangs, that have left a couple generations of girls absolutely traumatized, and there's no coming back from something like that. Yet, human rights focuses on the perpetrators of these violent crimes. These are not non-violent crimes where somebody cannot access the judicial system. These are violent crimes. So, what is there any insight? This is just a thought that Western human rights are focused on perpetrators of violent crimes, and especially from certain communities. I do not see that leeway granted to, and it should not be. I'm not saying that say somebody is a Hindu, it is very rare. However, if somebody is a Hindu, I don't think they will be extended those courtesies. So how is it that people like Majid Freeman have such good political connects and are seen as protecting human rights, or even I think Rubina Begum, the name of the policewoman who tweeted and or maybe put it on Facebook her very racist diatribes against other people who were not Muslim, and she was working for the British government. So how does this just happen in a country like the
So
United Kingdom?
there's two dimensions to your question. So one, which is the easy one, is the white man's guilt. Because they have been, the British society in general has been pushed to believe that colonial past was wrong. It was essentially a regime of the oppressors,
Just
and
I would just have a I do have quite a disagreement with this for the simple reason that Winston Churchill is still shown as the hero, even on Doctor Who, which is the most quintessentially British show possible. Their books do not include anything about why colonialism was bad for the colonized. And it is not only Pakistan that was colonized, it was India as well. It was the jewel in their crown. They have statues to it in Glasgow and Edinburgh. So,
which is why I said there are two dimensions to this.
sure.
The white man's guilt, where you quite rightly you pointed out that the British textbooks generally don't pick up how oppressive the British regime in India was, or how colonialism destroyed cultures and ecosystems and ethos of various countries across the globe, India being one of them. How our own education system, our own Gurukul system was completely dismantled and dislodged, and it was completely replaced by the Macaulay education system, which I am also a part of, and I'm guessing many like me are also part of. It's quite unfortunate. But what I was trying to get to is the political side of things, how the polity of Britain essentially deals with this
I
particular
see.
issue.
Right. That makes
So
sense.
the polity of Britain views the Muslims particularly as a consolidated vote bank, because they do vote as a
Of
consolidated
course.
chunk. So, which is why there is a sense of political correctness when it comes down to any crimes omitting from the Islamic side, or which is institutionalized by the Islamic organizations as well. I mean, grooming gang is one of those issues that you rightly pointed out. There are stories. How about this one girl who's raped over 1,000 times by a perpetrator, and she said that I lost count after the thousand number. Uh, Her perpetrator, her handler, were essentially released back into society in a couple of years, and she was absolutely flabbergasted that every time she would go to the supermarket, every time she would go to Tesco's or Asda's to shop for her groceries, she would see them standing. So it's that kind of impact that they've had to deal with. It's absolutely traumatizing, and it's not correct. And all in all, this is political correctness, and it's stretched beyond belief now, where I think the British society is waking up slow and steady, but it's quite slow. The pace is quite slow. Suella Braverman, who's the Home Secretary, has spoken out about this issue quite vociferously, but she is not getting a lot of support even
She
from
is not.
within her party circles. There are many MPs who could have come out and used this opportunity to raise more awareness about how, while the grooming gangs have been in the UK, how many lives have been impacted by the grooming gangs. There was a study that came out that 1 in 17 Pakistani male in Rotterdam are essentially involved, uh, or are accessories to the grooming gang cases in Britain. So that is the level of, how deeply their tentacles are essentially rooted. The fact is that the British society hasn't still woken up to this issue. They're still not, you know, being, they're still not aware about how to deal with this problem and how this problem is actually spreading, just not in Rotterdam, just not in Oldham, but across the UK, even in parts of London, parts of Manchester, parts of Yorkshire, etc., etc. So hopefully,
So I remember discussing this with Wasik, who, he himself is of Pakistani origin. He's a British citizen, and he was quite vocal about how Rotterdam being crowned the children's capital of England is just, it's flabbergasting on so many levels that I think, we in India crib about our justice system so much. I think everybody's got a right to criticize what they dislike, but the UK government system, which, ours is also derived from, does not display a lot of hope for victims of violent crimes like this. It's horrifying to think that so many rapists are, on the streets right now and have no consequences to face because they can just go outside and do these things again. So, but also, coming to other crimes. So I appreciate that she made the point about Suella Braverman and her not getting enough support, because that's definitely been an issue. She is the first one in a long, long time to call out Islamic terrorism, as it were. And, we can see that with her as the Home Secretary, we can see more restrictions on people like Anjum Chaudhry. However, it's not enough. Like you said, I think, the bureaucracy, their entire system is very similar to India's. And if there is political will, things can get resolved. However, the political will still seems to be lacking, right?
that's correct. I mean, the political will is what they need to muster. I remember, I'd gone for a conservative, uh, a sort of organization meeting, and this is much before Rishi Sunak essentially became the prime minister. He was just, he had just put his hat in the battle at that point, and there were people of Indian origin who essentially asked this question. One such individual who I'm associated with is Dr. Vivek Paul, who actually asked Rishi Sunak this question personally: "What are you going to be doing about the grooming gangs?" And he was, I wouldn't say he was lip tight about it, but I would say that he was not far from being lip tight. Uh, so even a person like him was being politically correct, where he could have actually seized the opportunity to raise more awareness within the British people to say this is a problem that needs to be addressed, and the people who do not wish for this problem to be addressed are people in the opposition, people in the Labour Party. Keir Starmer being one of them, who essentially, sorry, say that again.
No, of course.
Yeah,
I think he's been very outspoken about his support of, violence against even the British themselves. The not British, everybody's British, but against people of Indian origin, Hindus. He's been quite supportive of the perpetrators and of the perpetrators of the rapes against the grooming gangs also. So. But yeah, my question then is, if we are very sure that this is due to internal domestic vote bank politics, why is there no suitable, significant counter from the non-Muslim side to go and create a vote bank? Because look, it is a democracy, and democracies have their pitfalls. It remains the most effective system in play to, have change in government and have a people's representation, so to speak, in administration. So why are people, especially Hindus, especially the most affected people, right? Whether it's the white working class whose women were attacked and targeted and attacked, whether it's the Hindus, whether it's other immigrants who are not Muslim, how is it that nobody's come up with the idea of coalescing into a significant vote bank? Because the numbers more than overcome the Muslim population there. which is also very large. And they've been
Because
at this for a long time. So yeah,
while the question is brilliant, the answer to this is, is something that we see in India all the time. Because the majority is essentially fragmented. They're driven by their own self-interests rather than collective societal interests. When I say the self-interest, it's imagine, them being like a dodo bird. A dodo bird never thought about what is happening to his or her peer. If they were being attacked, if they were being
true, true.
abducted, they would just carry on with their own lives. And unfortunately, the majority in both India and Britain is effectively work like that dodo bird, where we are completely sidetracked by our own self-interests, our own self goals, and we completely forget about the societal interests. In hindsight, when you look at the Islamic institutions and the organizations, the way they work, it's it's absolutely amazing. You will be amazed to see how structured they are, how fluid their institutions work, and which is why they're essentially being able to assert themselves politically, to ensure that the political parties, whether on the right side of the center or the left side of the center, they're all cognizant of the Muslim vote bank. Whereas when it comes to the Hindu vote bank, there is nothing called a Hindu vote
That
bank,
is
because
so.
the, the people of the British Hindu diaspora, they sort of divided into two realms. One who work within the services sector, especially within the government sector, and one who work within the private sector, which is the financial institutions, etc. So the ones who work within the private sector, uh, you know, people like investment bankers, traders, IT analysts, would typically vote for the conservative government or the Conservative Party. People who work with the NHS and the public services or any of the governmental services would typically vote for the Labour Party, because that's how the Labour Party is structured. They essentially give a lot more importance to the NHS, at least verbally. Talking about their issues, talking about their pay hikes, talking about their holidays, which the Conservative Party does not do to that extent. So that's the sort of dichotomy that the other majority essentially faces, because they're too fragmented, they're too divided between themselves. So they need to come to some sort of a common minimum program, where there is an understanding that these are the quintessentials, which is absolutely non-negotiable, and that is how we will use our power to vote, our power to democracy, to ensure that our voices are heard. Until that happens, this is going to be status quo, unfortunately.
So I will say one thing: everybody works from from an individual gains perspective. However, like you said, because of the structure that the Muslim bodies have in the UK and anywhere abroad, honestly, they are able to convey to their Muslim populations, to those who come to their mosques, to those who listen to the sermons, that this is individually beneficial. Voting for a particular party is individually beneficial to for each individual Muslim, and so they can live as they wish to. And this is missing with the Hindu populations. There's nobody representing their interests. So, I mean, interests are individual eventually. However, the threat of violence is real. It's been executed much more than is discussed. It's happened across centuries. It's happening even now. It's happened across decades. It's happened in the UK. It's happened in Australia. It's happened everywhere. Very recently, I mean, it's not in the distant past that we saw the South African Hindus who have been there since generations being attacked because just because when things are dire, when the economy is in a shambles, which it is, people who are more successful will always be called up, and Hindus do tend to be more successful because they're not focused on violence. They have a very low rate of crime. They are highly educated and they contribute to society. And none of that saves the Hindu has saved the Hindus in Kashmir, has saved the Hindus in Pakistan, has saved the Hindus in Bangladesh. However much we assimilate, we are always going to be othered by those who have very strict definitions of who the internal people are. And this needs to be communicated through structures like you very rightly pointed out that they've existed for a long, long time. So I think that's something that we have to think about. Now, my other question, based on something that you said when the question was put.
Before you come to your other question, can I just add in one dimension to
Absolutely.
what you just said? So, I hate to admit it, but hostage politics does work. And what the Muslims in Britain are playing is hostage politics. For example, I'll give you an instance. There's this place called Peterborough, where for the last 20 years, the Muslim institutions and the organizations in Peterborough have been raising requests with the local councils for the azan to be
On loudspeakers, yeah.
yeah to be used by the loudspeakers. It had been rejected for all these years, but it got approved this year. It's because of the dynamic changes in the political realm in Peterborough. How your population changes, how people functioning or rather working within the governmental organizations change, and you will notice that more often than not, Muslims are not, or rather, they're not apprehensive of going into governmental jobs. They're not apprehensive of working within local council bodies, which the Hindus are. The Hindus will essentially want, or the British Hindus will essentially want to work within high paying institutional jobs, or want to be working within absolutely skilled areas, which is essentially doctors and scientists and university academicians, etc., or work within the financial institutions where you get a lot of bonuses, where you get high paying jobs. Your children can essentially go to private institutions for education, whereas the Muslims are not so bothered whether or not their children are essentially going to a private institution for education or a state funded institution. So that is the kind of difference that I would like to outline between how these two communities function in the UK.
I actually I will go back to the point that this is I think it's very it's a good observation that Hindus do prefer to work in high paying jobs. They think about generations after themselves, and when it's a completely different mindset, right? Like, you have to think about your own community. However, the view of community should be broadened for Hindus, is the idea here. Because I will say that even while working as a doctor, there is nothing preventing Hindus from setting up something like you did. There is nothing preventing other Hindus from creating a counter to the Indian American Muslim Council, right? They refuse to do so. We need people from all walks of life. However, they do not assert themselves as Hindu in public. Prayer is something that they keep private, and that is not, to be honest, that's not how Hinduism works either. Hinduism is as communal a religion as any other. We have community places of worship, and it's just a consequence of constant raids by the Turks and then the British, that we have had to make our worship private, and that is not the mentality that one should be carrying to a free country. So the organization can come down to, it's not about, and the hostage population politics is something that I have actually pointed out in a different context, even recently in my writings. And it's very true that when the demographic changes, there is one particular community that will make use of this. It's very disappointing that just being aware of this is somehow not politically correct. That if Hindus are aware, because Hindus do not display hostage population politics at all. It doesn't matter how politically, I mean, Rishi Sunak is very open about his faith, but it is very much as an individual practicing in as a private player. It is not as somebody who is a uh, Hindu advocating for Hindu rights, which is not the way
What
how
you're
they
trying to do is you're trying to draw a parallel between how Rishi Sunak acts and how someone like
Sadiq Khan
a Sadiq
or
Khan would essentially behave.
Hamza Yusuf or anybody.
Exactly.
So that's very different, because they advocate for Muslim rights very openly. Everybody's got a right to advocate. We just even don't go that route. So that's disappointing, and that's I think very threatening as a people if you're constantly in fear. It's just that fear to even speak out. It's just that when the consequence comes, it's a physical violence, as we've seen so many times before, and so many um,
I
ways
mean,
that
one
we can
one
think
of
of
the
that.
one of the issues which I saw personally is the fact that when you look at the Islamic institutions in Britain, especially, they function like a single monolith. When you look at the Hindus, the Hindus aren't a single monolith. If in fact anything, the Hindus are a collection of minorities. For example, I'm a Jain, somebody else is a Sikh, somebody else is a Shaivite, somebody else is a Vaishnavite. So it's a collection of minorities, which is why they cannot function like how the Islamic
It's very
institutions.
easy to say that, but I've done some research on this, and honestly, they only think that look, it's the Christians also function like that, the Muslims also function like that, only when they're outside. I mean, you have Moroccan boroughs; they don't get along with the Turks hate the Pakistanis look up to the Saudis who also hate them. So I mean, you have to pretend to be Indian when
But
you're
then,
being
but then
extricated.
in
When
hindsight,
sorry, I just
like,
want to make
I
a
was
point
just
that
going
when you're outside, you function as one
No,
blob.
but the one thing which differentiates the Islamic institutions or people within the Islamic fold versus any other civilization is the fact that their threshold uh, to any sort of attack is extremely weak. So the moment you attack the Prophet, the moment you attack the Quran, the moment you attack their faith, they are triggered, and that galvanizes collectivity, that galvanizes them to essentially unite and oppose your ideas. Whereas when you look at the Hindu fold, if somebody comes and abuses and criticizes Lord Shiva or Ram, we're usually not triggered by it. We may feel unhappy and uneasy about it, but that will not allow a pure galvanization of all of the Hindus to come together and say this is wrong. So that is the
Others,
way
I
it would
think you're
differentiate.
very correct. It's not the threshold, though. At least now, with the research, one is that our education after colonialization, we've had the communist systems keep this in place. However, I do not blame Hindus for this, for the simple reason that one groupthink is not something that we ascribe to. We've always welcomed Samvad Vivad, right? That's a religious practice for us. So we have a practice of philosophy. It's extended to Jains and Sikhs who have created different months based on this philosophy of not being part of groupthink, and that diversity is very welcome. What is different here is that the threshold for violence is very low. It's not so much a trigger for emotional appeal. It is a trigger for violence, and any soft thought can be kept in place with only hard power, and that is something that Muslims have exhibited. Do we want to pursue that route? I'm not quite sure. Another thing is that with regards to assembling together, um, the othering capability of othering that is based in a victimhood supremacist mindset is missing. We do not other people. We've been open to embracing other faiths, other races. We've had empires
Parsi,
that are dynasties that are
yeah, we've
you
had
know,
Parsis who've essentially come into India, and we've
those
accepted them.
they came in as immigrants, and they keep their culture alive within their own group, and nobody's got a problem with it. uh, the Turks, whenever the Mongols, the Timurid Empire, the Gorkhani Empire was never part of the Indian ecosystem, but that's not the example I'm making. But the Sakas, the Hunas, they've eventually they did come together and become Indian. And we have so many different tribes in the northeast with all of their very rich history that has been preserved exactly as it were. But this is not a diversity that is population that is possible in any other society that believes in a homogenized idea of divinity. And so it's not understandable to a Western population. And this is something that is sort of contradiction, a paradox for the Hindus abroad, because they go out with the same united in diversity mindset, not needing to push forth our perspective because we do not other people based on our shared victimhood, our historic trauma, intergenerational trauma. We don't push it on people today. Like, you are not responsible for possibly what your ideological ancestors have done in Kashmir and Armenia and every other place. So we don't hold that. However, a lot of Muslims do, and it's from a supremacist mindset. The victimhood is ascribed to the white people, but the supremacism is given to, reserved for Kafirs, or mostly
Mhm.
Hindu. So, and I see it's very easy to get into. I see a lot of breakaways when it comes to Dravidians trying to fit in as diaspora people. They also try to be as white in their thought process or as supremacist. And the way to depict that, and Khalistanis as well, the way you've probably come across that video it was in the US, it's not really British, but there was this Khalistani guy who was kicking a Hindu man in a, I think, KFC or some other place like that, where he's talking about how you need to get out of our country. You put yourself with the former colonizer, which you don't have to think of them as colonizers because you're there and you live there. So yeah, you can be British, but you definitely don't forget that you have that just because of your skin color, because of your faith, there has been action, physical action against you and your ancestors. But Khalistanis also do that. Pakistanis do that when it's convenient. So that supremacist victimhood mindset is not there. It's not something that is philosophically acceptable to a lot of Hindus, and it's not easy to think of someone like that. It's not a very civilized way of being in our part of the world. So I understand it. However, needs to be some sort of overarching narrative that needs to draw us together. So I do keep away from thinking that I just hope that there's a possibility we can coalesce based on other factors. But I understand why we haven't, especially for a post-colonized nation that is finally thinking about talking about these things. Adit, how 5 years ago would you be on here doing this? 10 years ago, would you even think of it? So I don't think these discussions were quite common.
Yes, while you say that is correct, I should remind you. So when the Leicester riots happened,
Mm,
and that, before we started, I told you that was my trigger point, and that is what activated me to go on ground and
absolutely.
show solidarity for what is essentially happened, and also talk about the false narratives that the media was playing out using Majid Freeman as their poster boy, as some upholder of human rights, where in reality all he is a terrorist sympathizer and a complete bigot. Um, but to galvanize even 50 Hindus to come out and protest outside the BBC, it was the toughest challenge. We had 3 weeks to prepare. I was on social media. I was calling up my relatives. I was calling up my friends. I was imploring them to call up their friends and families, etc., to come out and join us. And we could literally manage 100 people out of the millions who actually live in the UK. That unfortunate. That's extremely unfortunate for for a community that prides itself for being Indian, for being Hindu, for being associated with a civilization which is 5,000 years old, but yet you cannot come out and call out a spade when you see one. What do you call that?
So
So there is.
I absolutely sympathize with you here. I'm not saying that the problem does not exist. What I'm saying is that I understand why it exists. It's because we don't have that mentality. We don't go in there, plus the consequences, because we know Muslims vote as a vote bank, and they will always be favored when it comes to consequences. They will have none. Whereas somebody who's Hindu is thinking about losing their jobs. It's you'll probably lose your life next time, but then in the moment, that's all they can think about: losing their jobs, having their families affected, their neighbors not welcoming them, because they eventually have to live there for a long time. People aren't there for good, as far as they know. And that's a mindset that's been created due to the reasons I think I've mentioned, that they don't have that institutional support, and it cannot be set up because the Muslims have had it for decades. And that's something that Vasik had himself mentioned, how even the grooming gangs have been active since the 80s.
Yeah.
So they've been protected for crime. And even, I mean, Hindus have not been protected for defending them. Actually, they've not had a chance to defend themselves. So there's no institutional support. And so until that is created, until there's a political will to act as a group, that is, I don't think the situation unfortunately is going to change. And I'm very grateful that you're doing all the things that you're doing, because it's extremely necessary. And for all of the audiences, if you can contribute in any way, intellectually or otherwise, to the Indic society, I welcome you to do so. I'll leave a link to your to the uh, website below and in the description box. So yeah, back to the subject. Thanks for engaging with me on that. I just, I've heard all these arguments, and I've myself wondered as to why this is, and talked about this with so many people there, and try to understand. And I get their perspective. It needs to change, and we can do this chicken and egg circle with the institutions not there, the individuals not there, and it's the same across the world, really. However, people are finally waking up. That's my thing. That finally they're waking up. So we may see people, motivated people like yourself, hopefully push others to do things like that. Once you have that physical presence, when you get a group together like that, it's very impressive that you got 100 people together, because I know how hard that would be. You've gone through thousands of people. Maybe the next time some more people feel, that they can participate, and the next time there will be more because they've had. Sorry, yeah, fingers
I was just
crossed.
saying, fingers crossed.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, just going to the Khalistan, to the security problem that the UK has bred for anti-Hindu and anti-India activity, we also have the Khalistani outfits, just parading with absolute freedom, no consequence. Again, this seems to be a pattern
Yeah,
with
I
the
mean,
police.
you would have recalled not so long ago, Dr. Jaishankar, he appeared in a ANI podcast, and he mentioned something extremely interesting, which is, the West, especially countries like the UK, have become sort of breeding grounds for a anti-India ecosystem. And we're seeing very often that politics of India is being played by other means in the West,
Yeah,
and which is why we're seeing this nexus of the Khalistanis with the Islamists, and then you have the stop caste discrimination gang, which you have written about not so long ago. All of this cabal, the dismantling global Hindutva gang, all of them sitting together, working in conjunction, being propped up by not only independent institutions in the West, and my references to George Soros, but also the governments in the West. Nothing happens. We cannot absolve the British government for what is essentially playing out in Britain in terms of the anti-India narrative, the anti-India activities. And this is not something new. It's been happening ever since the 70s. When they decided to support the Pakistani ISI, when they decided to support the Pakistan's K2 strategy, which was the Kashmir and Khalistan issue. This was all a playbook straight out of the MI6, and the MI6 and the ISI were completely hand in glove. We're seeing a lot of attacks come into existence at this point of time against Indian missions abroad, whether that be in the United States, whether that be in United Kingdom, in Canada. But this is not the
Australia.
first time it happened. This happened right in 1984 when Ravindra Matre was essentially murdered, and the British agencies, they were willfully providing shelter to all of those people with questionable background, be it the Kashmiri terrorists, the Khalistanis. And this shows either the security state apparatus has completely failed, it's timidly fearful of these extremists, and they have not been able to create the adequate and appropriate deterrence to act against them. I mean, one of the Geneva Articles 31 essentially states that the host nation must protect
Of
the
course.
premises from the intrusion and damage. The British security lapses was called out by the Indian dispensation for the attack that happened on March 19th
Mm,
at the Indian embassy. But the reciprocity was completely missing. Yes, we may have pulled down the security outside Janakpuri and
I mean,
Um,
that's more than we've had in the past, so I was very grateful for it, but it
yes,
was just for show. It was not very real.
yes.
And yeah,
I mean, there should be more reciprocity that
way more.
we need to hand them out with. We need to start talking to, Scottish separatist leaders. We need to start
Absolutely,
engaging,
absolutely.
Northern Ireland separatists, and we need to tell the British that, if you carry on this sad route of, allowing enough space for anti-India elements to break, or break India forces. Uh, you want to platform them, you want to allow them space within the British society, then reciprocity is all we can hand out. Colin Bloom, he's an academician and interfaith academician essentially, and he published a report for the United Kingdom government only a couple of months ago, where he pointed out that Khalistani extremism is one of the biggest threats that the British society is essentially facing. So you're essentially harboring Frankenstein's. You're building Frankenstein's in your own backyard. How much longer can you ensure that this Frankenstein doesn't come and attack you? Is the point that Colin Bloom essentially made in his observations.
I think this is something that the CIA is also extremely familiar with now because they've funded the Taliban for so long via Pakistan. I mean, sure, we can argue that they didn't really know about it, but we can't really buy into it so much. But they've done this a lot, so Western governments are actually quite familiar with the results. However, they've had to face very little consequence of it themselves. That pushes me back to my first question. India is a democracy. India is a very functional, multifaceted democracy, uh, and so is the United Kingdom. It is also a friend of the as a government, government to government. There is a lot of strategic value in the relationship. And so, why is it that these governments, especially, we're discussing the UK here, why is it that they're so comfortable with anti India activity on their grounds? Does it require more economic assertion? Does it require a different strategy? I'm not sure, what is with them. We can talk about Canada, but it's of less consequence than, the US or the UK. And so I'm just focusing on the UK here.
Like I said, because it is the UK that has given asylum to
Yeah.
all of these Khalistanis and Islamists. If you were to go out to King's College, if you were to go to London School of Economics, you have to see the way these Khalistanis and Islamists are essentially given platforms to come out and essentially advocate for breaking India, for going against an entire civilization which is 5,000 years old, spreading false narratives about the caste system in India is so derogatory and it's so divisive, etc., etc., without understanding or having any basic understanding of what Hinduism is. I mean, if you ask one of these dolls, I don't think anyone would have read even a single Vedic text to actually
Mhm,
understand.
mhm.
But essentially, the British government in the garb of human rights has been protecting these elements and has been using them from time and time again against India. Now, whether it be the Conservatives, whether it be Labour, I don't think they're much different to each other because they're both equally responsible for what is essentially panned out over the past few years. I mean, this attack on the Indian mission or Indian consulate building on Strand on March
Mhm.
19th was not the first time. It's happened previously in 2019. It's happened previously in 2016, I think it was. So it's happened a multiple number of times. Now imagine the repercussions if a similar attack did happen on the British High Commission building in Chanakpuri. Can you imagine the kind of diplomatic hoo-ha people would be making? The media would be completely up in frenzy. But unfortunately, our institutions, our diplomacy, our media has not gone to that extent, which it should have. Which is why they've allowed. I'm going to admit that the Khalistanis are a very fringe minority within the sort of wider
Sure.
Sikh diaspora.
Of
The Sikh
course.
diaspora, if you look at it
Yeah.
in all, if you look at the referendum numbers, right, the Khalistanis will come out and say, "Oh, we got 1,000 people to come out and vote for us. We got 5,000 people to come out and vote for us." That is not even 10% of the entire Sikh
Right.
population that lives in the UK or even Canada for that matter. So they are extremely small minority, but they are
Absolutely.
a very violent minority, which is known to use, they've used violence, they've used intimidation tactics to essentially establish their discourse and their politics in Britain.
All right. Adit, it's been really great discussing this subject with you, and I definitely look forward to all of your writings. And for the audiences, if you like, please do share this video. It's an important subject, and it's with somebody who is based in the UK who has personal experience trying to counter these sort of narratives and violence. So please do give it a thumbs up. It's free. There's I've added a picture of a dodo when Adit talks about us. So just to thank me for that, just like it, share it. Adit, thanks so much for joining, and I'll see you soon.
Thanks, Agarika. It was an absolute delight to have interacted with you, and hopefully we will have much more of these. Thanks
Absolutely.
so much.